Yay! We made it to chapter two. Okay, chapter one was long, but chapter two is going to repeat some of the things we did in chapter one. So hopefully things will start clicking. Chapter two talks about the resolution of private disputes. And what does that mean? That means civil lawsuits, which means what? That means somebody is suing somebody, or an entity or business or somebody, or the government is suing somebody for um, agreements, right? And it's the purpose is to make the person whole. In the terms of the government, they might be taking civil law action to protect consumers or things like that. So we're going to be talking only about civil law, okay? So these are the hot topics to be covered in chapter two. The trial versus appellate courts, there should be a handout that you need to review that'll cover that. We're going to talk about personal jurisdiction. The next video, I'll talk about subject matter jurisdiction. Appeals and the court system will be in your court systems video quiz. And then we'll talk about civil procedure and alternative dispute resolution. Okay? So let's start with personal jurisdiction. What does that mean? Jurisdiction is the power of a court to hear a case, okay? Regardless if you're at the state or the federal level, the court has to have power. They have to have jurisdiction. And where does their power come from? Well, there's two kinds of jurisdiction. We have subject matter jurisdiction and we have in personam jurisdiction. And both, the court needs both. You have to have subject matter and in personam. We're going to talk about in personam, which is also known as personal jurisdiction. There's two ways to get personal jurisdiction. One is in rem, and that means if the dispute involves property in a state, that state court, we're talking about where, by the way, when we're talking about personal jurisdiction, we're talking about what state, the state, a court in that state can hear the case. In personam talks about where does personal jurisdiction occur over the defendant. And I'm going to explain this to you. What we need to know is in personam or personal jurisdiction is all about where in the country we're going to let the courts hear this case. And when we deal with in personam, which is about the person, it's the defendant. And why is it the defendant? Go back to due process. Remember, we have a right to due process before we can be deprived of life, liberty, or property. And if someone's taking you to court, they're trying to take your property away. Doesn't matter if it's the government. So they're saying, you know what, courts? We're only going to let you do that because the court's a government body. We're only going to let you put a judgment to take someone's property away if that person has had their due process. And this is procedural due process because it's what procedures do we have to take to sue someone, okay? So the defendant then is who we're going to focus on, okay? And again, this is about due process. So how does a state have, how does a court in a certain state have the ability to put a judgment against you? Okay. And what they say constitutionally is you can have general jurisdiction. If you serve a defendant in a certain state, I'm from Missouri, but I want to file a lawsuit against you in Kansas. You're from Missouri. Guess what? If I can serve process of you in that state, then that state will have jurisdiction. Okay? If the defendant's agent, so if you're a business and your agent is served in the state, or if the defendant domicile, we're going to talk about domicile in a second, or of course if the defendant consents. And so that means the defendant says, you know what? I'm going to waive it. It's okay. I don't need to be served. All right? That's general. Specific means a state can hear a case if the defendant had been doing business in the state or was contracting to supply goods or services, committed a tort, and what a tort is a civil wrong, a car accident or something like that, and that was in the state. Or if I committed a tort outside the state, meaning let's say I manufactured a product somewhere and the product was bad and the harm it produced was in the other state, that other state can have jurisdiction, and so does the one where the harm was produced, okay? So basically, do you see arising from? If the lawsuit arises from, all right? The defendant has such minimum context to not offend fair play and substantial justice is the standard. What does that mean? That means basically, is there enough context with the defendant? Are they served there? Is their domicile there? Did they consent to it? Did they commit a tort, or they're doing business? That it would not offend the fair play and substantial justice. It will give them justice. Okay? So let's talk about a case that's in your book. So I'm going to give you the overview, but you will need to read that. Abdush v. Lopez, and here are the facts. Helen Abdush from Nebraska had a copy of a book that was personally inscribed her name and a note to her by the author. Okay, the book was stolen. Ken Lopez is the owner of a bookstore, and he sells rare books, and he bought it from a seller in Georgia. Don't worry about the seller in Georgia. They don't really have anything to do with this. But he sold it to a customer not in Nebraska where Helen lives. Okay, and he's a Massachusetts resident, and that's where his store is. Okay. Lopez used a picture of the inscription and actually referenced Helen in advertisements on his website to sell this book. Okay, so what do we have here? Abdush sued Lopez in the bookstore. She said, my rights were violated because you used the inscription and to advertise. Lopez says, well, wait a second. You sued me in Nebraska, and you don't have jurisdiction. And the Nebraska court said, we don't have jurisdiction over Mr. Lopez, and Abdush appealed to the Supreme Court of Nebraska. And the question was, did the Douglas County, Nebraska court have personal jurisdiction over Lopez and his bookstore? Because if they don't, it offends due process, right? So they can't hear the case. We know that his bookstore was in Massachusetts and he lived in Massachusetts. So it's fair for him to be a court of Massachusetts to put a judgment against him if one gets awarded, right? And if he sold the book, let's say in Wisconsin, he could be sued in Wisconsin because he's doing business. He sold it there, right? But we know that he did not sell it in Nebraska. He doesn't live in Nebraska, and his home's not, and his bookstore's not there. But what Helen argued was, well, he advertised on the website. And the court said, no, that's not going to be good enough. Okay? Personal jurisdiction over a party is only proper if there's engaged conduct purposely directed at the forum state. And advertising on the website did not really repeatedly target Nebraska. So the same thing with if you have, for example, if you sell on Etsy, that doesn't mean anybody can sue you in any state, right? Only if you have enough contacts with a forum state, right? But if you're simply posting website information, that cannot be based on that, okay? So you have to look at if someone's advertising online, how much interactivity is actually with a specific state. Am I only soliciting in that state? Am I only advertising in that state? The invasion of privacy, they said, well, your privacy would have been invaded in the state that he sold to, because otherwise we're just going to say any state again, because even though it was advertised. So it wasn't directed towards Nebraska, and his acts were not aimed at Nebraska. So that's not enough. It's not fair to expect we can take him to court all the way in Nebraska because you have a grievance with him. Remember, this is about the defendant, because the defendant is the one being hailed into court and the one being asked to answer. So what happened is the court reversed it and said no jurisdiction. So when you look for personal jurisdiction, what you want to look for is the defendant's ties. And do they have enough ties there that it would be just for a court of that state to enter judgment if one is awarded? We are next going to address subject matter jurisdiction.